morning, our speaker is Albert Pennybacker. Penny was born and raised in Chattanooga, Tennessee, graduated from Vanderbilt University, did his master's degree at Yale. He has an honorary doctorate from our Bethany College. He served as pastor in Connecticut, up in Connecticut, and then up where I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, and Shaker Heights, Ohio. During those years, at the heart of the civil rights movement, Penny was very active in convening the local ministers and in welcoming Dr. Martin Luther King to Cleveland during that era. For 16 years, he was the pastor at University Christian Church in Fort Worth, Texas, which then was our largest disciple congregation, some 4,000 members. Everywhere Penny has been, he served his local congregation with the heart of a pastor and the community with a heart for social justice. He has served our disciple denomination in so many different ways. I won't list them. He has served through the National Council of Churches, the World Council of Churches. He has taught at Lexington Seminary, at Bright Divinity School. He's been trustee here, there, and everywhere. He's a modest man and has, among the many ministers at Central Christian Church, along with all of you ministers at Central, has been very supportive of me. And so I welcome him, and let's all welcome Albert Pennybacker. Penny?
Oh my, well, it's really an honor to be here and to know that folks that have spoken at this gathering in the past. I'm really pleased to be a part of the morning gathering. In getting ready for what I need to say, I called David to ask him exactly what he wanted me to say, and he told me exactly what he wanted me to say. And if you believe what I just said, you don't know either one of us very well. You don't need to listen for the phrase we're hearing so much these days. My name is David Shirey, and I approve this message. Rather, the other one floating around is appropriate. The views expressed in this presentation are not necessarily those of the church board or the management. David did give me a helpful outline. And I gather those who've spoken before have spoken to it as well. And 3 points: who have been your mentors across the years, mentors. Difficult times, and how did your faith become a resource of strength and understanding in those times? Difficult times. What are you grateful for? The whole issue of gratitude. So we'll ramble along on those 3 points in the time allowed. And mentors, difficulties, and gratitude. And I'll hang around after everybody wants to correct me. First, mentors. There's so many. Life is a bundle. Up by your own bootstraps is simply not true. So the list. Rabbi Sam Sandville has made me read Finkelstein's 4-volume History of the Jews. And he told me why he couldn't listen to Wagner's music anymore. Theologian H. Richard Niebuhr, my faculty advisor in seminary, Ronald's brother. We had a hot gospel entering student that year who cornered Mr. Niebuhr with the question, have you been saved? Mr. Niebuhr responded, oh yes. Excited, the student went on, can you tell me the day and maybe even the hour? And Mr. Niebuhr was quietly thinking, and then he replied, every day. Yeah. Mentor. My boyhood neighbors, the Palmers, and Mr. Will was an electrical engineer loaned by TVA during the war years to the Oak Ridge Atomic Project. We didn't really know what we were doing then, you remember, and he never hesitated. In 1948, he died of radiation cancer. And Ms. Palmer, Margaret, was the Christian education director for a neighboring Episcopal church. Whenever she was short a wise man for the Christmas pageant, guess who? I want to tell you, I have carried more gold to an Episcopal altar than any Episcopalian I know. My first lessons in ecumenism. Dr. Dorshad, an outdoorsman, a dentist in our church, he took me under his wing after my father died when I was 13. He taught me to catch fish, breathe the skies, walk the mountains. It didn't hurt that he had two beautiful daughters. Sadly, maybe mercifully, a few years older than I and a little out of reach. Mentors, so many. I have to take refuge in that line in Hebrews, for time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, David, Samuel, the bundle of life across the generations. Let me pick just two mentors. One, a celebrated astrophysicist and avowed atheist, whose name you will recognize, Carl Sagan. The other, wonderfully gifted Christian pastor of the Chattanooga congregation in which I grew up, whose name very few will know, John Paul Pack. Carl's scope of knowledge was vast, the smartest person certainly I've ever known. Only the whole universe would sufficiently capture his scientific commitment. When he became so well known through his TV series Cosmos, wherein he presented the scientific endeavor with the lure of romance and captured a lot of youth interest in the scientific enterprise. Folks began to ask about his background and ask questions, and one of the people they asked was Stephen Jay Gould, who was the evolutionary biologist at Harvard, you remember. By coincidence, he and Carl Sagan had been classmates in high school together. And so one of the questions was, why did, to Gould was, why did you become this eminent biologist and Carl becomes this astrophysicist? Why did you choose such separate directions? Oh, Gould said, that's easy. Carl looked up and I looked down. And so Carl was teaching me how to look up. The interviewer once asked Carl who his mentors had been. And the interviewer expected him to name some eminent scientist, perhaps a Nobel Prize winner, but he quickly replied, my mother and my father. Then the surprised interviewer asked, what did they give you? He said, a sense of skepticism and a sense of wonder. Now hold on to that. It was his skepticism excuse me, that led him away from any rigid or sterile religion. Credible truth for Carl was, as for most scientific minds, credible truth required evidence. It was evidential truth. Otherwise, it was suspect. And the scientific evidence is that we humans in our world, despite the claims, we simply were not the center of the universe. Galileo had the evidence, and the religious powers made him swallow it. Carl was passionately against our hubris. And he showed our Earth on the screen as a pale blue dot down in the left-hand corner. It was his pushback, you see, from this
Human exaggeration, that's how we talked about it. From his toolbox of scientific integrity, he taught me about the scope of the human exaggeration that in religious vocabulary we call sin. We've long ago in our churches embraced and encouraged scientific pursuit, evidence-based truth, but the human exaggeration of sin is still with us. Don't forget the other gift from his parents, wonder. That's another kind of truth. It lives in aesthetic truth or a kind of passionate, emotional truth. I prefer poetic truth. I saw it operational in Carl's life. It was a small dinner party at Joan Campbell's New York apartment. How many years ago? I don't know. As the conversation turned from the events of the day to one after another, Carl sat listening, and then a light came on his face. I saw it, and he commanded, "Wait! Now I understand. You are ecumenical Christians, and that means you have room for folks like me."
Wow.
The snow that night was ferocious. Guests left. Joan dismissed the dinner staff, and she and Annie cleared the table, and Carl and I did the dishes. He wiped and I washed. Imagine. We talked and we became friends. I may be the only person in New York that night who thanked Jesus for the snow. I saw Carl live out the wonder side of his life. We were working on environmental issues, the National Council of Churches folks, Jewish Religious Action Center, the Catholic Bishops Conference, National Association of Evangelicals. And we got to the final wording of our advocacy for the environment. The National Association of Evangelicals, some of the evangelicals balked. It sounded too much like evolution. We struggled. After all, we were on the same planet. It would be good to get together. But it was Carl who found the wording. We don't have to agree on how the world began to care about how it turns out. And we all signed on because at the heart was the wonder of the environmental vision. Joan and I visited with Carl at the Hutchinson Cancer Center in Seattle. And he told us at that point that he decided he was not an atheist. He was still agnostic. But that leaves room for religious folks like you. After his death, when I got back to my office, I had a voicemail from Carl. He wanted to talk further about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for our country to address persistent racism. Had he lived, had he lived. Mentor number 2, John Paul Pack, our pastor during my formative years. It's no surprise that a pastor would be one of my mentors, I suppose. From my family, I too had a touch of the skeptical that Carl talked about. We were in that time in our community surrounded by religious views and voices that I began to sense were wide of the mark, rigidly judgmental to the point of being mean. And I believed then and I believe now that mean religion is a bad deal. Let me put it simply. Mean religion, bad religion, centers on me and what happens to me when I die. Which has to mean that this world and my neighbor are relatively unimportant. I'm glad I grew up in a congregation that believed that what happens in this world is important. And my neighbor is important. More than me and more than my hereafter, those things I leave in the hands of God. And we can trust the God that we know in Jesus with them. John Paul Pack led our congregation with that kind of mind and heart. His preaching was authentic. He established our ties, for instance, with the Ox Temple congregation, and Rabbi Feinstein became our friend, my first interfaith understanding and friendship. He was attentive to children and made time to teach the pastor's class and baptized us on Easter. We welcomed folk across the color divide to sing and speak and share a meal, and that was not easy in the 1940s.
Wow.
He brought the news that my older brother Frank had been killed in the Pacific early in the war, the first in our time, in our town. He sat with us and talked and prayed. My first touch with the reality of death. When he was called to serve another congregation, he's left his mark on me, renewed across the years. When I was 57, I finally told him I'd lived long enough to forgive him. He'd not left his mark only on me, but on the unfolding future of that congregation. Mentors. Now, not my intention. I hope you don't think that. These two and all the others were not focused on mentoring me. It was a way of living that they embodied. It drew me in not to be other than myself, but to be better than I would have been without them. That bundle of life. Okay, number 2, difficulties. If you want to know about my personal difficulties, that is the human struggle, just know this: no preacher is exempt. Change a few names and numbers, and my experience is that what you experience is what I experience, and we share the same turf.
Amen.
So you already know about all that. And so I'm not going to...
Beautiful.
I want to talk about pastoral difficulties.
All right.
One, what I learned in the civil rights struggle, which once again is rising up among us. And the other, pastoral care when it confronts the persistent human question, why? Oh God, why? I was away from Cleveland speaking at the National City Christian Church in Washington when word came that a young Presbyterian minister who, with the clergy group to which I belonged, had been run over and killed by a bulldozer while picketing a challenged school site. I had not planned to preach that Sunday, but now there was no choice. It was my task as pastor to embrace this tragic event and interpret it in the context of the Christian gospel. The inescapable text from the 15th chapter of John, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Following the service, one of our deacons headed straight for me. His face was flushed, his fist clenched. I thought he might hit me. Instead, he yelled his anger and battered me with words, and some were colorful, others stood aside. He said he and his family would never be back. I never saw them again. But I knew that we were directly engaged in the civil rights struggle. It could not be pushed aside. It was in our own house. And we would be with it for the long haul. There was faithfulness as well as anger, sometimes costly faithfulness. And I had to deal with both. The gospel is clear. There is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. God's love is universal. He has made of one blood all the nations. Just think how silly it is to base how we feel about another human being on skin color. It's absurd. That congregation began to get it. Joan Campbell, that worked with the Stokes campaign, had arranged Dr. King's visit to our church. David referred to it. 3,000 people came. A few of our members left. Bob Harwood, a senior vice president of Republic Steel, lost his future when he asked the wrong people the wrong questions about hiring practices. He ended his career tending 4 steel warehouses. I had a lunch appointment with one of our folk whom I'd not seen on Sunday for about 3 months. He headed a very large company that made furnace bricks for the steel industry, the best bricks, I was told. We were friends. After the small talk, I told him I'd been missing him. He confirmed and went on to say he wanted to know what I was doing in these race troubles that had kept him away. And there it was, up front and center. Now listen, I know how to be diplomatic and to give safe answers, even to fudge a little bit sometimes in a good cause. But this time it had to be straight and clear. Gospel, personhood, social justice, nothing left out. We talked for 2 hours. He asked questions I'd never thought of, questions I weren't prepared for, and I tried to give him the most honest answers I could, and finally there was silence. And then he said, I think I disagree with everything you've said. And I thought, well, you win some and you lose some. This time I lost. And then he went on, but I don't think you're grandstanding. I think you believe what is happening and what you're doing is right. And that's good enough for me.
Thank you for that comment.
That was anything but what I expected. Oh, you little faith. With that, he reached down for his briefcase, opened it, and handed me 7 months of Sunday offering envelopes generously filled. He stood up, shook my hand, took the lunch check, and said, I'll see you on Sunday. The gospel insists on integrity.
Thank you.
And he taught me that. We are just now entering a new struggle over racial justice, and we will need to trust the gospel. Bill Barber, a Black Disciples preacher, you may have heard him spoke at Philadelphia. Leader of the Moral Monday movement, calls what is happening now the third Reconstruction. The strategy he calls fusion. And what he means is that folk with integrity, black and white, fused for a just and healing future. You see, racism is sin, and we don't beat sin, but we struggle with it. And God is with us in the struggle, and that there is gospel promise in the struggle. Difficulties. In providing pastoral care across the years, there's been no more difficult question than a simple, persistent one. Why, oh God, why? When I was a pastor in Norwich, Connecticut, the local paper told the tragic story of a house fire where a mother and her 2-year-old died. When asked, the stunned husband, father, told the reporter, it is the will of God. And I told my flock on Sunday, the God I know doesn't will that mothers and babies die in fires like that. check the attic wiring. In a larger sense than why. I remember two shocking teenage deaths just a week apart also. One in an auto accident, a body fractured from a fall. One family put aside wanting God to answer their questions and turned to the church for God's strength and care. The other blamed God's failure, turned away altogether. The church was serving a useless God. I expect on this eve of 9/11, there are a host of families and friends across the country, maybe all of us, for whom this anniversary rekindles the question, why? Let me have a run at it that may open a different way, a helpful way to think about it. If all we've got is a God who does our bidding, finds me a parking place, brings my horse in the money, this time makes the lottery numbers square with mine, rewards. If God had just put his foot on our brakes in the car, why didn't God keep me from falling? Protection. You get the point. That's pretty thin religious equipment when it exploits the power of God. David Kelsey, a fine theologian, suggests that we have to understand that our human power and how we use it is different from the power of God. The God we see in Scripture, the God we meet in Jesus, is about a different understanding of power. We think of power as authoritarian. We exercise it that way, a decree from on high, a thunderbolt in the right place. Or maybe it's arbitrary. I'll pick this one, not that one. We do that. Maybe even whimsical. I like that pretty one who's ripe for a favor. These are top-down exercises in power. These are dictatorial. And the Bible rarely presents God as a dictator. We don't want a dictator in heaven or in the White House. Now you make whatever you think. What we see in Scripture is what Kelsey called God's empowering power. God exercising God's power in empowering us. God who walks with us in the face of whatever we encounter. Through the desert, along the Emmaus Road, into your hands from Jesus at the cross. Empowering us. And then the question why is not so much about an explanation as it is about a companionship. About the power to live in faithfulness as the power of God. Think about what we mean by God's power. I think it helps with the question. So now gratitude. Gratitude. For starters, I'm grateful for all the above. Mentored, big and small, Christ-like lives I've known, folks with courage, folk who let me share their pain and tolerated my stumblings, a bristly industrial brick maker who taught me what I should have known, all of them. Let me tell you about my Texas neighbor. Bill was a big ranch cowboy who'd come to town and grown older. His religious understanding was a little more than a thimble deep. He belonged to a church that believed that anyone who believed otherwise than it was going to hell, maybe even before dying. Bill put me and most of my neighbors in that category of spiritual jeopardy. But I noticed the strangest thing. When anyone on the block had troubles, illness or death in the family, damage or injury, material loss, Bill and his wife were the first ones to call. with a dinner prepared or offered to help or chauffeuring service or protection if they had to be away from home. It happened again and again. I saw him in the yard one day and we were chatting over the fence and I finally said, "Bill, I just want to tell you, you live better than you believe." And I'll take the living over the believing anytime, anytime. I'm grateful for Bill and I'm grateful for his spiritual kid in Kentucky. Life is such a bundle. Every week I read that special Herald Leader column on notable deaths. Hardly ever is there a piece there about someone I know. But there's hardly one each week who's not done something to enrich my life, or extend the human possibilities, or open before me some larger vision of beauty and truth. I'm grateful for them, these unknowns in the bundle of life. I'm grateful for the larger church of which we are a part. Personally, I've been given opportunities I'd never imagined here in our land and around the world. Did you know that several years ago, I was the national president of our Disciples Christian Youth Fellowship. Look at me now, that's pretty hard to imagine.
1 year.
There. But I traveled across the country and spoke in churches and youth gatherings. What I'm truly grateful for is I saw people caring for people, engaging life, changing what was plain wrong, especially if it was unjust, playing, laughing, praying. I think I would never have entered ministry if my sense of God's call had not been backed up with what Carl Sagan might have called religious evidence. Faithful living. We'll never settle the doctrinal debate. Never. That's what his role is, actually, is to keep us debating and struggling. We never will settle it. And so we have to look for faithful living. I'm grateful to our congregation here. I'm grateful that it believes this world is important far more than me and my getting to heaven. And our neighbors are important, that bundle again. Important in pursuing social justice, in being a part of the daily interchange, in our politics. People say, politics and religion, no, listen, they're among the few things you're worth talking about. In our simple caring, in our refusal to live in narrow boundaries, that both limit us and exclude others, our ecumenical and interfaith ties. I'm grateful for our congregation. I'm grateful for our communion table that's spread each week, welcoming to us. Baptism, as you know, is the once-for-life sacrament, anchoring us. But communion is the repeatable sacrament. It's food for the journey. It's the weekly ration for the living of these days. I'm especially grateful that it's a table of forgiveness. So much of life stumbles on promises made and promises not kept. We grateful for a table of forgiveness. Tutu's right. There's no future without forgiveness. So the table of forgiveness is always about the future. And our opportunity to live more faithfully with one another and in the ways of God. Joan Camel was presiding at communion in a largely black congregation. At the invitation to the table, she had used the traditional words, "His body broken for you, his blood shed for you. She really ought to be here to tell this story. At that point, a little girl about 6 broke away from her mother's grip and ran excitedly down the aisle. Everything stopped, and in that hush moment, all could hear her say, "For me, for me." And Joan, of course, replied, "Yes, my dear, for you." I am grateful for the empowering generosity of God. Thank you.